The mahogany conference table gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, its polished surface reflecting the confusion etched across my face as I stared at the documents spread before me. My signature, or what was supposed to be my signature, stared back at me from 3 different pages, each stroke unfamiliar, each curve wrong. The silence in the law office of Hartwell and Associates stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant hum of traffic on Fifth Avenue below. "I'm sorry, Miss Chen, but could you sign this verification form for me?" Attorney Margaret Hartwell's voice cut through my bewilderment, her silver-rimmed glasses catching the light as she slid another document across the table. Her fingers, adorned with a simple wedding band that had clearly seen decades of wear, trembled almost imperceptibly. In her 30 years of practice, she had developed an eye for forgery, and something about the way her jaw tightened told me she already suspected what I was beginning to realize. My hand shook as I picked up the Mont Blanc pen, a gift from my grandmother before she passed, its weight familiar and comforting in moments of uncertainty. The ink flowed smoothly across the cream-colored paper, forming the characters of my name in the precise, slightly slanted handwriting I had perfected during countless hours of calligraphy practice as a child. Elena Mei-Lin Chen. Each stroke deliberate, each curve intentional, each dot and dash carrying the memory of my mother's patient corrections at her kitchen table. Mrs. Hartwell's sharp intake of breath confirmed what the churning in my stomach had already told me. She reached for a magnifying glass from her desk drawer, the kind used by jewelers and document examiners, and held it over the papers with the practiced steadiness of someone who had done this many times before. The leather chair creaked beneath her as she leaned closer, studying the signatures with the intensity of a detective examining evidence at a crime scene. "These don't match," she said finally, her words falling into the room like stones dropped into still water, each syllable creating ripples of implication that spread outward. "Not even close, actually. The pressure points are different, the letter formation is inconsistent, and the flow—" She paused, removing her glasses to clean them, a nervous habit I had noticed during our previous meetings. "Miss Chen, did you sign these documents regarding your grandmother's estate?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a just extinguished candle, acrid and lingering. My grandmother's estate. The modest 2-story house on Maple Street where I had spent every summer of my childhood, where the scent of jasmine tea and steamed dumplings still seemed to permeate the walls. The house where she had taught me to fold paper cranes and shared stories of her journey from Guangzhou to America with nothing but a suitcase and unwavering determination. The house that, according to her will, was supposed to be mine. "No," I whispered, the word barely audible above the sudden roaring in my ears. "I've never signed these. I've never even seen them before today." The realization hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and leaving me gripping the edge of the conference table until my knuckles turned white. Someone had forged my signature. Someone had tried to steal my inheritance, my grandmother's final gift, the tangible piece of her legacy that was meant to anchor me to our family's history in this country. Mrs. Hartwell's expression shifted from professional concern to something deeper, more personal. She had been my grandmother's lawyer for over 15 years, had witnessed the careful planning that went into every aspect of her estate, had seen the love and intention behind every decision. "Elena," she said, using my first name for the first time since we had met, "I need to ask you a difficult question. Do you have any idea who might have access to documents with your signature? Someone who might have been able to practice copying your handwriting?" The question pierced through the fog of shock that had settled over my thoughts, and suddenly, unbidden, a face appeared in my mind. Marcus. My cousin Marcus, with his easy smile and persuasive charm, who had always been just a little too interested in what everyone else had, just a little too willing to bend the rules when it suited him. Marcus, who had been at every family gathering for the past 2 years, who had helped clean out Grandmother's house after the funeral, who had access to her papers, her documents, and most importantly, her collection of family letters. Letters I had written to her over the years, each one signed with my careful, practiced signature. "There might be someone," I admitted. my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like betrayal, like I was accusing someone of a crime based on nothing more than a gut feeling and a pattern of small deceptions that had accumulated over the years like dust in forgotten corners. But as I spoke, memories began surfacing with uncomfortable clarity. Marcus asking too many questions about grandmother's assets during her final illness. Marcus volunteering a little too eagerly to handle paperwork and legal matters. Marcus, who had seemed surprised, no, disappointed, when the will reading revealed that the house had been left to me. Mrs. Hartwell nodded gravely, her fingers already reaching for her phone. Elena, I'm going to need to call the police. Document forgery, especially in matters of estate fraud, is a serious felony. But first, I want you to think very carefully about what you're about to set in motion. Family disputes involving criminal activity? She paused, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone who had witnessed the devastating aftermath of such situations. They change relationships forever. Are you certain you want to pursue this? The weight of the decision settled over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating in its implications. This wasn't just about money or property, though the house was worth nearly $500,000 in the current market. This was about trust, about family bonds that stretched back generations, about the sacred nature of a grandmother's final wishes. This was about Marcus, who had been like a brother to me growing up, who had taught me to ride a bicycle and defended me against schoolyard bullies, who had stood by my side at grandmother's funeral with what I had believed were genuine tears streaming down his face. Outside the office windows, the city continued its relentless rhythm, unaware of the small drama unfolding in this oak-paneled room. Cars honked in the distance, pedestrians hurried past with their heads down, and somewhere in the building, a phone rang insistently. The normalcy of it all felt surreal, as if the world should have paused to acknowledge the moment when I discovered that someone I loved had betrayed not just me, but the memory of the woman who had been the heart of our family. I need to know the truth, I said finally, my voice gaining strength with each word. Grandmother deserved better than this. If someone forged my signature to steal from her estate, then they need to face the consequences, no matter who they are. The decision felt both liberating and terrifying, like stepping off a cliff with the hope that I would learn to fly before I hit the ground. Mrs. Hartwell's smile was sad but approving. She had seen this moment before, the instant when someone chose justice over comfort, truth over family peace. "I'll make the call," she said, already dialing. "Detective Morrison at the Financial Crimes Unit has handled several cases like this. He's thorough, discreet, and he understands the complexities of family situations." As she spoke into the phone, explaining the situation with the clinical detachment that came from years of legal practice, I found myself staring at the forged signatures again. The handwriting was good. Whoever had done this clearly had practiced, had studied my letter forms and attempted to replicate them. But there were tells, subtle differences that spoke of deception. The E in Elena was too sharp, lacking the soft curve I always made at the bottom. The dot over the I in Mei-Lin was perfectly round, while mine always had a slight teardrop shape from the way I lifted the pen. Small details, but in the world of document analysis, small details could unravel entire webs of deception. The call ended, and Mrs. Hartwell turned back to me with the expression of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. "Detective Morrison will be here within an hour. He wants to examine the documents while they're still in our controlled environment, before anyone else handles them." "Elena," she paused, her voice taking on a gentler tone, "are you prepared for what comes next? Once the investigation begins, there's no going back. Your family will know. There will be questions, accusations, probably denials. Some people might ask you to drop the charges, to keep the peace." The question struck at the heart of my fears. I thought of family dinners that would never be the same,
of cousins choosing sides, of aunts and uncles whispering about the girl who called the police on her own blood. I thought of my parents, who had worked so hard to maintain family harmony, who believed that problems should be solved quietly, privately, within the walls of the family home. I thought of Marcus's parents, Uncle David and Aunt Linda, who had been like a brother to me growing up.
Second set of parents to me, who would be devastated by the accusations against their only son. But then I thought of grandmother, tiny and fierce, who had worked 2 jobs to put my grandfather through medical school, who had saved every penny to buy the house on Maple Street, who had planned every detail of her estate with the careful precision of someone who understood the value of hard work and honest money. She had trusted me with her legacy, had believed I would honor her wishes and preserve what she had built. How could I do anything less than fight for what she had intended? "I'm ready," I said. And for the first time since entering the office that morning, I felt the solid ground of certainty beneath my feet. Whatever happens, I need to know the truth. Grandmother would have wanted the truth. Mrs. Hartwell nodded approvingly, then began gathering the documents with the careful efficiency of someone preparing evidence for examination. As she worked, organizing papers and making notes, I found myself wondering how this had all begun. When had Marcus first looked at those letters and seen not cherished correspondence from a beloved cousin, but practice sheets for forgery? When had he decided that his need was greater than my inheritance, that his desires justified betraying the trust of a woman who had loved us both? The grandfather clock in the corner chimed the half-hour, its deep, resonant tones a reminder that time was moving forward, carrying us all toward a confrontation that would reshape our family forever. In less than an hour, Detective Morrison would arrive. In less than an hour, the wheels of justice would begin turning, and there would be no stopping them. But even as I sat there, waiting for the next chapter of this story to unfold, one question continued to echo in my mind, a mystery that the police investigation might solve, but that would haunt me regardless of the outcome. How long had Marcus been planning this? And more importantly, what else had he been willing to do to get what he wanted? The drive home from Mrs. Hartwell's office felt like navigating through a dream where everything familiar had shifted slightly, where the streets I knew by heart seemed foreign under the weight of newfound knowledge. My hands gripped the steering wheel of my aging Honda Civic, grandmother's practical influence evident even in my choice of reliable, economical transportation, as I tried to process what the next few hours would bring. Detective Morrison would arrive soon, armed with forensic tools and decades of experience in unraveling deceptions that cut through the heart of families. I lived in a modest apartment above Chen's Golden Kitchen, the restaurant my parents had owned and operated for 23 years. The building sat on the edge of Chinatown, where the scent of star anise and soy sauce mingled with the urban perfume of car exhaust and ambition. As I climbed the narrow stairs to my second-floor apartment, each step echoing in the stairwell like a countdown, I could hear my mother's voice drifting up from the kitchen below, speaking rapid Cantonese to my father as they prepared for the dinner rush. My apartment was small, but carefully arranged, every piece of furniture chosen for both function and the memories it held. The rosewood coffee table that had belonged to grandmother dominated the living room, its surface scarred by decades of use, but polished to a warm glow. On its surface sat a collection of items that told the story of my life. A jade plant that grandmother had given me for luck, a stack of architectural sketches from my job at Morrison and Associates, no relation to the detective, and a framed photograph from last year's Chinese New Year celebration, where the entire extended family had gathered around grandmother's dining table, faces bright with laughter and anticipation. In that photograph, Marcus stood directly behind grandmother, his hands resting gently on her shoulders, his expression the picture of filial devotion.
Looking at it now, I searched his face for signs of the deception that must have already been taking root in his mind. Had he been calculating the value of her jewelry as he smiled for the camera? Had he been mentally cataloging her possessions while helping her serve homemade dumplings to the gathered family? The thought made my stomach churn, and I had to sit down on the small sofa that faced the window overlooking the alley behind a restaurant. Outside, life continued its normal rhythm. Mrs. Park from the Korean market next door was accepting a delivery of fresh vegetables, her practiced eye examining each bundle for quality. A group of teenagers hurried past, their backpacks heavy with textbooks, their conversation a mix of English and Mandarin that reflected the cultural duality that defined our neighborhood. I had grown up in this duality, straddling two worlds with the careful balance of a tightrope walker. At home and in the community, I was Mei-Lin, the dutiful daughter who helped in the restaurant on weekends and holidays, who translated documents for elderly neighbors and served as a bridge between generations. At work and in professional settings, I was Elena, the architect who had graduated cum laude from Berkeley, who could navigate zoning laws and building codes with equal skill in English or Chinese, depending on the client's needs. Grandmother had understood this balance better than anyone. She had been the one to suggest I use both names, Elena, Mei-Lin, when I started school. In America, you need an American name to open doors, she had explained in her practical way. But you must never forget your Chinese name, because that is where your roots grow deep. She had been right, as she was about so many things. The combination had served me well in my career, allowing me to work with diverse clients and communities while maintaining my connection to my heritage. But it was more than just names and cultural navigation. Grandmother had been my constant, my anchor in a world that often felt like it was moving too fast. When I was 8 and struggling with the casual racism of elementary school classmates who made fun of my lunch or mocked my accent, she had taught me calligraphy as a way to find peace and precision, beauty in tradition. When I was 16 and torn between my parents' expectations and my own dreams, she had been the one to encourage my interest in architecture, seeing it as a perfect blend of artistry and practicality that honored both sides of my nature. Build things that last, she had told me during one of our weekend walks through the city, pointing out buildings that had weathered decades of change while maintaining their essential character, not just with bricks and steel, but with honor and purpose. Make things that people will be proud to leave to their grandchildren. Those words had shaped not just my career, but my entire approach to life, my belief that what we create should endure beyond our own temporary presence in the world. The irony was devastating. I had spent my adult life trying to build things that would last, while someone in my own family had been planning to steal the most lasting thing grandmother had built, the security she had tried to provide for my future. The house on Maple Street wasn't just real estate. It was the foundation she had laid for the next generation, the tangible proof that an immigrant woman with limited English and unlimited determination could create something permanent in a country that often felt temporary. My phone buzzed against the coffee table, interrupting my spiraling thoughts. A text message from Marcus himself, the timing so coincidental it felt almost surreal. "Hey, cuz! Haven't seen you since the funeral. Want to grab dinner this week? I miss our talks." The casual tone, the friendly emoji, the reference to our missed conversations, it all felt like a slap in the face now that I knew what he had been attempting. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to read between the lines. Was this genuine? Was he reaching out because he genuinely missed our friendship, or was this part of some larger strategy? Had he expected the forged documents to be processed by now? Was he checking to see if I suspected anything? The questions multiplied in my mind like fractals, each one spawning new doubts and possibilities. Marcus and I had grown up more like siblings than cousins. Our mothers were sisters, both part of the second generation born to immigrants who had arrived in America with dreams as vast as the Pacific they had crossed. Uncle David had built a successful accounting practice, while my father had chosen the more uncertain path of restaurant ownership. Despite their different approaches to the American dream, the families had remained close, gathering for every holiday, celebration, and crisis. Marcus was 3 years older than me, which in childhood terms made him simultaneously a protective figure and a source of endless frustration. He had been the one to teach me to ride a bicycle in the park behind grandmother's house, running alongside me with steady hands on the seat until I was ready to pedal on my own. He had also been the one to convince me to sneak cookies from grandmother's kitchen before dinner, always managing to avoid punishment while I faced her disappointed frown. Even then, there had been signs, small things that I had dismissed as typical older cousin behavior, but which now took on more sinister implications. The way he would borrow my toys.
And forget to return them. The way he would volunteer to help with family finances, always positioning himself as the responsible, trustworthy nephew. The way he had gradually inserted himself into grandmother's daily life over the past few years, becoming her go-to person for rides to medical appointments and assistance with paperwork. I had been grateful for his help at the time. My job required long hours and occasional travel, and knowing that Marcus was looking out for grandmother had eased my guilt about not being available every moment she might need me. Now I wondered what opportunities those moments of trust had provided. How many documents had he seen? How many signatures had he observed and studied? How many times had he sat in her living room, surrounding the evidence of her careful financial planning, and calculated what he believed should be his? The sound of footsteps on the stairs pulled me from these dark reflections. Heavy, measured steps that belonged to someone who climbed these stairs regularly. My father's voice called out in Cantonese, announcing his arrival with the formal courtesy that was his default mode of communication. Mei-Lin, may I come up? Your mother sent soup. I opened the door to find him holding a thermos that I knew contained wonton soup, my mother's cure for everything from heartbreak to headaches. At 62, my father retained the lean build of someone who had spent decades on his feet in a restaurant kitchen, though his hair had gone completely gray in the years since grandmother's death. His eyes, behind wire-rimmed glasses that he had worn for as long as I could remember, held the particular expression of parental concern that transcended language and culture. Ba, I said, using the Cantonese word for father that felt most natural in moments of emotional vulnerability. I need to tell you something important. As he set the thermos on my small dining table and settled into one of the mismatched chairs I had inherited from various family members over the years, I found myself struggling to find the right words to explain what I had discovered. How do you tell your father that his nephew, a young man he had helped raise and guide through the complexities of American life, had allegedly committed a felony against his own family? How do you explain that the trust that held extended families together had been violated in the most calculating way possible? How do you prepare someone for the storm that was about to break over all of their heads? Bah, I began again, my voice steadier this time. Someone forged my signature on legal documents. Someone tried to steal grandmother's house from me. I watched his face change as the words sank in, saw the progression from confusion to understanding to the particular kind of pain that comes from betrayal within the family circle. He listened without interruption as I explained about the lawyer's call, the document comparison, the imminent arrival of Detective Morrison. His hands, scarred from decades of kitchen work, remained folded in his lap, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his breathing had become more deliberate and controlled. When he finished speaking, he sat in silence for several minutes, processing not just the facts, but their implications for everyone we both loved. "Who do you think did this?" he asked finally, though I could tell from his tone that he had already reached the same conclusion I had. There were only so many people with access to both family documents and detailed knowledge of grandmother's assets. There were only so many people who would know exactly what forms needed to be filed and when. "I think it was Marcus," I said, the words hanging in the air between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. "I think he's been planning this for a long time." My father nodded slowly, his expression grave. "Your Uncle David will be devastated. Linda will refuse to believe it. This will tear the family apart." He wasn't arguing against pursuing the investigation. His sense of justice was too strong for that, but he was acknowledging the cost of seeking the truth. We sat together in the gathering dusk, father and daughter united in the understanding that our family was about to change forever. Outside, the sounds of the neighborhood evening routine continued. Restaurants preparing for dinner service, children being called in from play, the distant rumble of the subway carrying people home from their daily labors. But inside my small apartment, we were suspended in a moment of anticipation, waiting for the detective who would either confirm our worst fears or somehow provide an explanation that would restore our faith in the people we loved.
The wonton soup grew cold in its thermos, but neither of us moved to serve it. Some moments require stillness, require the space to absorb what has been learned and prepare for what is yet to come. In less than an hour, Detective Morrison would arrive with his questions and his forensic tools. In less than an hour, the investigation would begin in earnest, and there would be no more wondering, no more hoping that somehow we were wrong about what had happened. But first, there was this. A father and daughter sitting in the quiet of a small apartment, holding space for the grief that comes with understanding that love and trust are not always reciprocated, that families can harbor secrets as dark as any stranger's heart. Outside, the city hummed with its eternal energy. Inside, we waited for truth to arrive, wearing a detective's badge, carrying the tools necessary to unravel deceptions that cut deeper than any knife. Detective Morrison arrived precisely on time, which somehow made everything feel more real and irreversible. From my apartment window, I watched him emerge from an unmarked sedan, a compact man in his early 50s whose unhurried movements suggested someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. He wore a simple gray suit that had seen better days, and he carried a briefcase that looked like it had witnessed countless family tragedies and financial crimes. My father and I made our way downstairs to meet him, the weight of anticipation making each step feel deliberate and final. Mrs. Hartwell had returned to her office to meet us there, and the drive across town was conducted in near silence. Detective Morrison's presence filled the car with an energy that was both reassuring and ominous. Here was someone with the authority and expertise to uncover the truth, but also someone whose investigation would inevitably expose every secret, every weakness, every uncomfortable reality that our family had managed to keep buried beneath the surface of polite interactions and holiday gatherings. Back in the mahogany-paneled conference room, the forged documents were spread across the table like evidence in a trial, which, I realized with growing clarity, they might soon become. Detective Morrison examined them with the methodical attention of someone who had seen every variation of human deception, using a magnifying device that made the signature discrepancies even more obvious. The differences that Mrs. Hartwell had identified were magnified under his scrutiny. The pressure variations, the stroke patterns, the subtle tells that separated genuine signatures from calculated forgeries. "These are definitely not written by the same hand," he confirmed, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had testified in court about such matters countless times. The forger was skilled, but not skilled enough. They practiced, certainly, but there are fundamental differences in muscle memory and writing mechanics that can't be fully replicated. He pointed out specific characteristics with the tip of a pen, turning my signature into a roadmap of deception that revealed more than I had ever wanted to know about the planning that had gone into this betrayal. Now, Detective Morrison continued, settling back in his chair and fixing me with the steady gaze of someone about to ask questions that would require uncomfortable honesty. "I need you to walk me through everyone who would have had access to samples of your genuine signature, as well as knowledge of the timing and procedures for estate document filing. This level of specificity suggests someone with inside knowledge of both your grandmother's assets and the legal processes involved." The questioning was thorough and methodical, covering not just the obvious suspects, but every possible avenue of investigation. Who had access to grandmother's house during her final illness? Who had helped with sorting through her papers after the funeral? Who knew the details of her will before it was officially read? Who had the technical knowledge to understand which forms needed to be filed when and with which institutions? Each question built a case that pointed more clearly toward Marcus, but Detective Morrison was careful not to lead me toward any particular conclusion. This was clearly his standard approach: gather all possible information first, then follow the evidence wherever it led. But as we talked, I could see him mentally constructing the same profile that had been forming in my own mind: someone with family access, legal knowledge, financial motivation, and the personality type capable of such elaborate deception.
I'll need to interview all the family members who had access to the relevant materials, Detective Morrison explained. This includes your cousin Marcus, but also other relatives who might have been present during document sorting or estate planning discussions. I want you to understand that this process will be disruptive. People will know they're being investigated. Word will spread through your family, and there will likely be pressure on you to drop the charges or handle this privately. His words proved prophetic, faster than anyone could have anticipated. Within hours of leaving Mrs. Hartwell's office, my phone began ringing with calls from relatives who had somehow already learned about the investigation. The efficiency of the family communication network, which had always been a source of comfort during celebrations and crises, now felt like a weapon being turned against me. Aunt Linda was the first to call, her voice a mixture of disbelief and barely controlled panic. "Elena, David just got a call from Marcus saying that police want to interview him about forged documents. This is ridiculous. Marcus would never do such a thing. There must be some mistake, some misunderstanding that can be cleared up without involving law enforcement." Her tone carried the desperation of a mother protecting her child, but underneath it was something else, a note of pleading that suggested she wasn't as certain of Marcus's innocence as her words claimed. The conversation was painful in ways I hadn't anticipated. Aunt Linda had been like a second mother to me during childhood, the one who braided my hair for school pictures and taught me to make her famous almond cookies. Hearing her voice crack as she begged me to reconsider the investigation felt like a physical wound, but I forced myself to remember why I was pursuing this in the first place. Grandmother's wishes deserved protection, regardless of the personal cost to family relationships. "Aunt Linda," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle but firm, "I didn't want this either. But someone forged my signature on legal documents worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. If Marcus didn't do it, then the investigation will prove his innocence and we can all move forward. But if someone did commit this crime, they need to face the consequences." Her response was a mixture of anger and heartbreak that would haunt me for weeks afterward. "How can you do this to your own family? Your grandmother would be devastated to see us turning against each other like this. She valued family loyalty above everything else. Don't you think you should honor that by handling this privately, within the family?" The accusation hit its mark with devastating precision. Grandmother indeed valued family loyalty, had spent her entire life building bridges between relatives and smoothing over conflicts before they could fester into permanent divisions. But she had also valued honesty and justice, had taught me that doing the right thing was sometimes more important than doing the comfortable thing. The tension between these values was tearing me apart, but I couldn't let emotional manipulation override my obligation to seek the truth. Uncle David's call came later that evening, and his approach was different, more analytical, more strategic. As an accountant, he understood financial crimes and their consequences in ways that went beyond emotional appeals. "Elena," he said, his voice carefully modulated, "I've been thinking about this situation, and I believe there might be alternate explanations we haven't considered. Document mix-ups happen all the time in estate proceedings. Perhaps someone at the law firm made an error, or there was confusion about which version of which forms were final." His suggestion was creative but implausible, and we both knew it. The forged documents weren't simple errors or mix-ups. They were sophisticated attempts to redirect inheritance assets through carefully manipulated paperwork. But I could hear in his voice the same desperate hope that had characterized Aunt Linda's call, the need to believe that somehow this could all be explained away without destroying the family relationships that had anchored all of our lives. "Uncle David, I understand that this is painful for everyone,
but Detective Morrison has seen thousands of these cases, and he's certain that these are deliberate forgeries. The investigation will uncover the truth, and then we can all deal with whatever that truth turns out to be. The most disturbing call came from Marcus himself, 2 days after Detective Morrison had begun his interviews. His voice was different from the casual, friendly tone of his earlier text message. There was an edge of desperation, a note of calculation that I had never heard before. "Elena, I think we need to talk face to face. There are things you don't understand about grandmother's situation, financial complexities that weren't apparent in the will reading. Maybe we can meet somewhere private and sort this out between family members, the way grandmother would have wanted."
Something about the request set off every alarm bell in my mind. The suggestion of a private meeting, the implication that there were hidden financial issues, the invocation of grandmother's preferences, it all felt manipulative in ways that made my skin crawl. This wasn't the cousin I had grown up with, the one who had taught my card games and shared secrets during long summer afternoons. This was someone calculating angles and seeking advantages, someone trying to control a situation that was spiraling beyond his influence. "Marcus," I said, my voice colder than I intended, "if you have information that's relevant to the investigation, you should share it with Detective Morrison. I'm not comfortable meeting privately about legal matters that are now under official investigation." His response revealed more than he probably intended. "Elena, you're making a huge mistake. You don't understand the forces you're setting in motion. This investigation will destroy our family. And for what? Money? Property? Is that really worth more to you than the relationships that have supported you your entire life?" The implied threat was subtle, but unmistakable. He was suggesting that I was choosing material gain over family loyalty, that I was the one responsible for any damage that might result from the investigation. It was classic manipulation, shifting blame to the victim while positioning himself as the protector of family values. But it was also an admission of sorts, a confirmation that he understood exactly what was at stake and why the investigation posed such a threat to him. Detective Morrison's interviews were proceeding methodically, and each conversation revealed new layers of deception and manipulation. Other family members began sharing information they had previously kept private. Suspicious questions Marcus has asked about estate planning, unusual interest he had shown in legal procedures, odd requests for access to family documents that had seemed innocent at the time, but now appeared calculated and predatory. Cousin Jennifer, Uncle David's daughter and Marcus's sister, provided some of the most damaging testimony. During a tearful conversation with Detective Morrison, she revealed that Marcus had been struggling financially for months, that he had taken out loans against future inheritance expectations, that he had made statements about deserving a larger share of grandmother's assets than the will provided. She also admitted that she had found him in grandmother's study during the funeral reception, going through papers with an intensity that had seemed inappropriate for the circumstances. "I asked him what he was doing," she told Detective Morrison, her voice breaking as she relived the memory, "and he said he was looking for important documents that might need immediate attention. But he seemed startled when I walked in, like he had been caught doing something he shouldn't. I dismissed it at the time because we were all grieving and everyone processes loss differently. But now, thinking back on it, the investigation was uncovering a pattern of behavior that stretched back months, possibly years. Marcus had been systematically positioning himself as the family financial expert, the one who understood legal procedures and estate planning better than anyone else. He had cultivated an image of responsibility and trustworthiness that had given him access to sensitive information and family confidence. But underneath that carefully constructed facade, he had been planning and executing a crime that struck at the heart of everything grandmother had worked to build. As the evidence mounted, the family began dividing into camps. Some relatives, particularly those closer to Uncle David and Aunt Linda, continued to insist that there must be some explanation that didn't involve criminal behavior.
They organized family meetings designed to pressure me into dropping the investigation, arguing that family harmony was more important than legal technicalities. Other relatives, particularly those who had witnessed Marcus's suspicious behavior firsthand, began supporting the investigation and sharing their own concerns about his conduct. The division was painful in ways I hadn't anticipated. Family gatherings that had been sources of joy and connection for decades became battlegrounds of accusation and defensive loyalty. Cousins who had grown up together like siblings found themselves on opposite sides.
Conflict that seemed to reveal fundamental differences in values and priorities that had been hidden beneath the surface of polite family interaction. My parents, caught between their loyalty to me and their desire to maintain family peace, struggled to navigate the increasingly hostile atmosphere. My mother, in particular, found herself torn between her sisterly relationship with Aunt Linda and her protective instincts toward her only daughter. The stress began taking a physical toll on both of them, manifesting in sleepless nights and tense conversations that ended in frustrated silence. The restaurant, which had always been a neutral space where family members could gather regardless of personal conflicts, became another casualty of the investigation. Uncle David and Aunt Linda stopped coming for their regular Sunday dinners. Other relatives began choosing sides based on their relationships with the immediate families involved. The warm, inclusive atmosphere that had defined Chen's Golden Kitchen for over 2 decades began to feel strained and artificial. Mrs. Wong, an elderly family friend who had been coming to the restaurant since its opening, noticed the change immediately. "Where is everyone?" she asked my mother during one particularly quiet Sunday evening. "Usually this place is full of your relatives, all talking and laughing together. Now it feels too quiet, like something important is missing." My mother's response was diplomatically vague, but I could see the pain in her eyes as she attempted to explain the absence of half our extended family without revealing the devastating details of why they were no longer welcome at our table. The investigation had created a schism that went beyond the immediate question of Marcus's guilt or innocence. It had forced everyone to examine their own complicity in overlooking warning signs, their own willingness to prioritize family peace over individual justice. Detective Morrison's investigation expanded beyond the immediate forgery charges as new evidence emerged. Financial records revealed that Marcus had been systematically researching property values in grandmother's neighborhood, had obtained unauthorized credit reports using family information, and had even consulted with real estate agents about potential sales strategies for the Maple Street house. The scope of his planning was breathtaking in its detail and chilling in its implications. More disturbing was the discovery that this wasn't Marcus's first attempt at document manipulation. Detective Morrison uncovered evidence of smaller incidents over the past several years: utility bills redirected to his address during grandmother's hospitalizations, insurance documents with suspicious alterations, and financial statements that had been copied and studied with an attention to detail that suggested long-term planning rather than casual family assistance. Each revelation felt like another layer of betrayal being peeled away, revealing depths of deception that I had never imagined possible within our family. The Marcus I thought I knew, the protective older cousin, the responsible nephew, the family member everyone trusted with important matters, had been a carefully constructed facade hiding someone capable of systematic fraud against the people who loved him most. The psychological impact of these discoveries was devastating for everyone involved, but particularly for Aunt Linda and Uncle David. The son they had raised, the child they believed embodied the best of their values and aspirations, had been living a double life that violated everything they had taught him about honor, honesty, and family loyalty. Their grief was complicated by guilt, by the terrible question of whether they had somehow failed as parents or missed warning signs that might have prevented this catastrophe. Uncle David's accounting practice began suffering as word of the investigation spread through the professional community. Clients who relied on his reputation for ethical behavior started questioning whether someone who couldn't detect fraud in his own family could be trusted with their financial affairs. The irony was brutal.
A man whose entire career was built on financial integrity was being professionally damaged by his son's criminal behavior, despite having no knowledge or involvement in the crimes. The stress of the situation began manifesting in unexpected ways throughout the extended family. Cousin Jennifer developed insomnia and anxiety that required medical intervention. Other relatives found themselves questioning long-held assumptions about family members, wondering what other secrets might be hiding beneath the surface of relationships they had always taken for granted. The investigation had created a climate of suspicion that poisoned even innocent interactions, making everyone hyper-aware of potential hidden motives behind every conversation.
3 weeks into the investigation, Detective Morrison called with news that would escalate the situation beyond anything I had imagined possible. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to deliver information that would change everything, "we've discovered that the forged documents were just the beginning. Marcus has been involved in a more extensive financial scheme involving multiple elderly family members and community contacts. We're now looking at federal charges for elder fraud, mail fraud, and organized financial crime." The scope of Marcus's activities was staggering. He had used his reputation as a trustworthy family member to gain access to financial information from elderly relatives and family friends, then systematically exploited that access to redirect assets, manipulate insurance beneficiaries, and even established fraudulent power of attorney arrangements. Grandmother's estate had been just one target in a network of financial predation that stretched across our entire community. Mrs. Chen from the neighborhood association, Mr. Liu, who owned the hardware store, grandfather's elderly brother who lived across town, all had been victimized by someone they trusted, someone they had welcomed into their homes and treated as family. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was a violation of the entire social fabric that held our community together, a breach of the trust that allowed vulnerable people to rely on younger family members for help with increasingly complex financial and legal matters. The revelation transformed my understanding of everything that had happened over the past several years. Marcus's helpful presence during grandmother's illness, his assistance with other elderly relatives, his involvement in community financial planning, all of it had been part of a calculated strategy to identify and exploit vulnerable targets. What I had interpreted as filial devotion and community service had actually been predatory behavior designed to facilitate systematic theft. The federal involvement brought new investigators, new procedures, and new levels of scrutiny that reached far beyond our family's private pain. FBI agents interviewed dozens of family members and community contacts, following paper trails that revealed the full extent of Marcus's network of deception. The investigation that had begun with forged signatures on estate documents now encompassed bank fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy charges that could result in decades of federal prison time. As news of the expanded charges spread through the community, the Chinese-American families who had been Marcus's targets began coming forward with their own stories of financial manipulation and document irregularities. Many had attributed losses and confusing paperwork to their own unfamiliarity with American legal systems, never suspecting that someone they trusted was deliberately exploiting their vulnerabilities. Mrs. Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had lost nearly $50,000 from her retirement savings through fraudulent investment schemes that Marcus had convinced her to participate in. Mr. Wong had discovered that his life insurance beneficiaries had been changed without his knowledge, redirecting death benefits away from his children toward accounts controlled by Marcus. The pattern was consistent. Identify elderly targets with significant assets, gain their trust through family or community connections, then systematically redirect their wealth through a combination of forged documents, fraudulent financial products, and manipulated legal arrangements. The emotional toll on these elderly victims was heartbreaking. Many felt ashamed of having been deceived, embarrassed by their inability to detect the fraud, and frightened about their financial security during the most vulnerable years of their lives. The fact that the perpetrator was someone they had known and trusted for years made the betrayal even more devastating, destroying not just their financial stability, but their faith in the community relationships that had sustained them through decades of immigrant life in America. For our family, the revelation that grandmother's victimization was part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior added new dimensions of grief and anger to an already unbearable situation.
She hadn't been specifically targeted. She had simply been one of many elderly relatives whose trust and assets made her an attractive mark for someone willing to exploit family relationships for personal gain. The scope of the investigation began attracting media attention, which brought its own complications and humiliations. Local news outlets picked up the story of the family fraud ring that had victimized elderly Chinese Americans across multiple communities. Reporters called
The restaurant asking for comments, photographers lingered outside our building, and suddenly our private family tragedy became public entertainment for people who would never understand the cultural and personal complexities of what had been destroyed. The media coverage was particularly painful for my parents, who had spent decades building their reputation as honest business owners and respected community members. Seeing the family name associated with criminal behavior in newspaper headlines and television reports felt like a violation of everything they had worked to achieve in their adopted country. The American dream they had pursued so faithfully was being tainted by the actions of someone who had shared their hopes and cultural identity, but had chosen to exploit rather than honor the trust that held their community together. As the investigation continued to expand, revealing new victims and new layers of Marcus's deceptive network, I found myself grappling with questions that had no satisfactory answers. How long had he been planning these crimes? How many warning signs had we all missed? What kind of person was capable of such systematic betrayal of the people who loved him most? And perhaps most disturbingly, what else might we discover as investigators continued following the trails of financial manipulation that stretch back years into our family's history? The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning in late October, 6 weeks after the investigation had begun. Detective Morrison called while I was reviewing architectural plans at my office, my mind temporarily absorbed in the clean lines and precise measurements that offered refuge from the chaos that had engulfed my family life. His voice carried a note of satisfaction mixed with grim determination that told me immediately that something significant had been discovered. "Elena, we need you to come to the station. We've recovered Marcus's computer equipment and financial records, and there are things you need to see before we proceed with the formal charges." The drive to the police station felt surreal, as if I were moving through a movie rather than living my own life. Everything that had once felt solid and predictable, family relationships, community trust, even my own judgment about people I had known my entire life, had been revealed as fragile constructions that could be shattered by the actions of a single person willing to prioritize personal gain over every moral consideration. The interview room at the police station was sterile and functional, designed for difficult conversations that revealed uncomfortable truths. Detective Morrison had arranged several file folders on the metal table, each one representing a different aspect of Marcus's criminal activities. But it was the laptop computer sitting closed in the center of the table that drew my attention, its black surface reflecting the fluorescent lights, like a dark mirror hiding secrets I wasn't sure I wanted to see. "What we discovered," Detective Morrison began, opening the first folder to reveal printouts of bank statements and financial records, "is that Marcus has been involved in this type of fraud for over 4 years. The targeting of elderly family members wasn't opportunistic, it was systematic, planned, and executed with a level of sophistication that suggests extensive research and preparation." He showed me spreadsheets that Marcus had created, documenting the assets and vulnerabilities of dozens of elderly relatives and community members. Each entry included detailed information about financial holdings, health status, family relationships, and what Marcus had labeled exploitation potential. Seeing grandmother's name in that spreadsheet, reduced to data points about her house value and medical expenses, felt like witnessing her murder all over again. "This file was labeled Elena Project," Detective Morrison said, opening another folder that made my blood run cold. Inside were photocopies of letters I had written to grandmother over the years,
dating back to my college days. Each letter had been studied and annotated, with my signature analyzed and practiced in the margins. There were dozens of attempts to replicate my handwriting, showing a progression from crude forgeries to the sophisticated duplications that had almost succeeded in stealing my inheritance.
But the most disturbing discovery was a detailed timeline Marcus had created, showing exactly when he planned to file the forged documents, how he would handle any questions that arose, and what explanations he would provide if the forgery was discovered. He had contingency plans for multiple scenarios, including one labeled Family Pressure Protocol, that outlined how he would manipulate family loyalties and cultural values to discourage legal action if his crimes were exposed. He researched your schedule, your work commitments, even your relationship status, Detective Morrison explained, pointing to notes that revealed an intimate knowledge of my daily life that I had never realized he possessed. He was planning to time the document filing for a period when you would be traveling for work, giving him several weeks to establish legal standing before you might notice any irregularities. The laptop contained even more damaging evidence. Email correspondence with real estate agents about selling grandmother's house, research into offshore banking options for hiding stolen assets, and, most chillingly, communications with other individuals who appeared to be involved in similar schemes targeting elderly immigrants in different cities. Marcus hadn't been working alone. He was part of a network of people who specialized in exploiting the trust and vulnerabilities of elderly community members who had limited familiarity with American legal systems. FBI agent Sarah Chen, again, no relation despite our shared surname, had joined the investigation when the scope of the crimes became apparent. She explained that Marcus's network had been operating across multiple states, using family and community connections to identify and victimize elderly immigrants who possessed significant assets but limited understanding of financial protection measures. The scheme was particularly insidious because it exploited cultural values of family loyalty and respect for younger generations that made elderly victims reluctant to question or report suspicious behavior. What makes this case particularly complex, Agent Chen explained, is the way the perpetrators used legitimate family relationships and cultural expectations to facilitate their crimes. Victims trusted them because they were supposed to be trustworthy. They provided access and information because helping family members with financial matters is considered a normal and appropriate responsibility in many immigrant communities. The evidence revealed that Marcus had been recruited into this network during his junior year of college, when financial pressures and a gambling addiction had made him desperate for income sources that didn't require traditional employment. What had begun as small-scale document alterations and financial manipulations had evolved over years into a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars through the systematic exploitation of elderly immigrants across the West Coast. The gambling addiction was a revelation that added another layer of complexity to my understanding of Marcus's motivations. Financial records showed a pattern of massive losses at casinos and online betting sites, followed by increasingly desperate attempts to generate income through fraudulent means. The money he had stolen from family members and community elders hadn't been used to build a better life. It had been fed into a destructive cycle of addiction that required ever-increasing amounts of funding to sustain. Uncle David and Aunt Linda were called to the police station to review the evidence before formal charges were filed. Watching them absorb the full scope of their son's criminal activities was heartbreaking in ways that transcended the personal pain I had been experiencing. This was the destruction of parents' fundamental assumptions about the child they had raised, the collapse of beliefs about love, guidance, and moral development that had anchored their entire adult lives. Aunt Linda's reaction was particularly devastating. She went through the evidence in stunned silence, occasionally asking questions in a voice that grew smaller and more broken with each revelation. "When did this start?" she whispered, looking at printouts that showed Marcus's criminal activities had begun while he was still living at home, still presenting himself as the dutiful son they believed they were raising.
How could we not have known? How could we not have seen what was happening?
Systemic vulnerabilities could recognize the sophisticated planning that had gone into each fraud. For someone whose professional life was built on financial integrity, discovering that his own son was a calculating predator who had violated everything he stood for was a kind of professional death as well as personal devastation. "David," Detective Morrison said gently, "I need you to understand that none of this is your fault. Your son made deliberate choices to engage in criminal behavior, and he went to extraordinary lengths to hide those choices from the people who loved him. The planning and deception involved in these crimes required sustained effort over multiple years. This wasn't a moment of poor judgment or a single bad decision. This was a lifestyle built on the systematic exploitation of trust." But even professional reassurance couldn't penetrate the guilt and self-recrimination that consumed Marcus's parents. They blamed themselves for not detecting his gambling addiction, for not questioning his financial resources more carefully, for not recognizing warning signs that seemed obvious in retrospect, but had been carefully hidden behind a facade of filial devotion and family responsibility. The most difficult revelation came when Agent Chen showed us communications between Marcus and his criminal associates that revealed the coldly calculating nature of his approach to family relationships. Email messages discussed grandmother's declining health as an opportunity window for accelerated asset extraction. Text exchanges evaluated which elderly relatives would be most vulnerable to document manipulation based on their language barriers and unfamiliarity with legal procedures. In one particularly chilling exchange, Marcus had written about me specifically. "Cousin E is the biggest obstacle to the inheritance redirect. She's too involved in grandmother's affairs and too familiar with legal processes. Need to time document filing for her travel window and establish fait accompli before she can investigate." Reading those words felt like discovering that someone had been planning my emotional murder with the same clinical detachment they might bring to planning a business transaction. The evidence also revealed how Marcus had manipulated family dynamics to facilitate his crimes. He had deliberately encouraged family members to rely on him for financial guidance, positioning himself as the expert who could navigate complex legal and bureaucratic systems that intimidated less acculturated relatives. He had volunteered for responsibilities that gave him access to sensitive information, offered help with paperwork that allowed him to study signatures and financial details, and cultivated an image of trustworthiness that made questioning his motives seem like family betrayal. Perhaps most disturbingly, the investigation revealed that Marcus had been studying family members' psychological vulnerabilities as systematically as he had researched their financial assets. He had detailed notes about which relatives were most susceptible to guilt manipulation, which family members could be counted on to prioritize harmony over justice, and which cultural values could be exploited to discourage victims from seeking legal protection. Grandmother had been targeted not just because of her assets, but because Marcus had identified her declining health and increasing dependence on family assistance as factors that would make her less likely to question his involvement in her financial affairs. The help he had provided during her illness, rides to medical appointments, assistance with paperwork, companionship during lonely afternoons, had all been part of a calculated strategy to gain access to the information and trust necessary to steal her life savings. The revelation transformed my understanding of our family's final years with grandmother. Every kindness Marcus had shown, every helpful gesture, every moment of apparent devotion had been performed with ulterior motives that reduced her from a beloved matriarch to a mark in an elaborate confidence scheme. The grief I felt wasn't just for the money that had been stolen or the trust that had been violated. It was for the realization that grandmother's final years had been shadowed by predatory planning that she never suspected from someone she loved and trusted completely. As the full scope of the evidence was presented, other family members who had been defending Marcus began to confront the undeniable reality of his guilt. Cousin Jennifer, who had initially refused to believe that her brother could be capable of such systematic deception, broke down completely when shown email evidence of his plans to manipulate her own trust fund when she turned 25.
He was going to steal from me too, she whispered, her voice hollow with the recognition that her brother's love had been conditional on his ability to exploit their relationship for financial gain.
The community impact of these revelations extended far beyond our immediate family. As news of Marcus's arrest and the charges against him spread through the Chinese American community, other elderly residents began coming forward with their own stories of financial irregularities and suspicious interactions. The investigation had created a safe space for victims to report crimes they had previously attributed to their own confusion or cultural unfamiliarity with American financial systems. Mrs. Wu, who had lost her husband's life insurance benefits through forged beneficiary changes, described feeling stupid and ashamed when the money didn't arrive as expected. "I thought I had filled out the forms wrong," she explained through tears. "I thought my English wasn't good enough to understand the legal language. I never imagined that someone I trusted had deliberately stolen from me." The psychological impact on these elderly victims was profound and lasting. Beyond the financial losses, they had to confront the reality that their judgment about people they trusted had been catastrophically wrong. For immigrants, who had already navigated the challenges of adapting to a new culture while maintaining their values and traditions, discovering that their own community members were exploiting their vulnerabilities felt like a betrayal of everything they had worked to build in America. Agent Chen explained that this type of crime was particularly devastating for elderly immigrants because it attacked the social support systems that many relied on for navigating complex financial and legal requirements. When family members or community contacts become predators, she said, it doesn't just cause financial harm, it destroys the trust relationships that many elderly people depend on for survival and dignity in their final years. The evidence presentation concluded with a timeline that showed how Marcus's crimes had escalated over time, from small-scale document alterations to sophisticated financial frauds that involved multiple victims and interstate coordination. What had begun as opportunistic theft from family members had evolved into a criminal enterprise that threatened the financial security of dozens of elderly immigrants who had trusted him with their most precious assets. As we left the police station that day, carrying the weight of evidence that would soon result in federal charges and a trial that would expose our family's private pain to public scrutiny, I realized that the investigation had revealed more than just Marcus's guilt. It had shown us the fragility of the trust that holds families and communities together, the ease with which predators can exploit cultural values and family loyalties, and the devastating consequences when someone chooses personal gain over every moral consideration that should guide human relationships. But it had also revealed something else: the strength that comes from choosing truth over comfort, justice over family peace, and protection of the vulnerable over protection of the guilty. The investigation that had begun with forged signatures on estate documents had become something much larger, a reckoning with the values that define us and the courage required to defend those values when they're threatened by people we love. The trial began on a gray February morning, 8 months after Mrs. Hartwell had first noticed the discrepancies in my signature. The federal courthouse downtown was an imposing building of granite and glass that seemed designed to remind everyone of the weight and permanence of justice. But as I walked through its metal detectors and security checkpoints, I felt more fragile than empowered by the legal system that was finally addressing the crimes that had shattered our family. Marcus appeared in court wearing a navy blue suit that Uncle David had purchased for the proceedings, his appearance carefully crafted to present him as a young man who had made mistakes rather than a calculating predator who had spent years exploiting the trust of elderly relatives. The transformation was startling. Gone was the confident, charming cousin I had known, replaced by someone who seemed diminished and desperate, though I couldn't tell if his apparent remorse was genuine or simply another performance designed to minimize the consequences of his actions.
Demised more than 60 elderly immigrants across 3 states, stealing over $2 million through forged documents, fraudulent investments, and manipulated legal arrangements. Each day of testimony brought new revelations about the scope and sophistication of the crimes. Digital forensics experts explained how Marcus had used technology to research potential victims, study their financial holdings, and coordinate with other criminals to maximize the exploitation of vulnerable community members. Banking specialists showed how stolen funds had been laundered through multiple accounts and offshore entities designed to hide the money trail. Handwriting analysts demonstrated the progression of Marcus's signature forgery skills, showing how he had practiced and refined his technique over months of preparation. But the most powerful testimony came from the victims themselves. Mrs. Chen, now 83 and using a walker, took the stand to describe how Marcus had convinced her to invest her late husband's pension in fraudulent schemes that cost her nearly $50,000 in retirement savings. "I trusted him because he was family," she said in accented English that carried the weight of 50 years in America. "He came to my house, ate my food, called me grandmother. How could I know he was stealing from me?" Mr. Liu's testimony was particularly heartbreaking. The 78-year-old hardware store owner had discovered that his life insurance policies had been altered to redirect death benefits away from his children toward accounts controlled by Marcus. "I worked 60 years to leave something for my family," he said, his voice breaking as he struggled to maintain composure. "This young man took away my children's inheritance while pretending to help me with paperwork I couldn't understand." Grandmother's case was presented as part of the larger pattern, but hearing the details recounted in the sterile environment of a federal courtroom somehow made the betrayal feel both more real and more surreal. The prosecutor displayed the forged documents on screens visible to the entire courtroom, pointing out the specific ways Marcus had attempted to redirect the house on Maple Street to accounts he controlled. Each piece of evidence was a fresh wound, but also a validation that pursuing justice had been the right choice, despite the personal cost. The defense strategy was predictable, but painful to witness. Marcus's attorney portrayed him as a young man struggling with gambling addiction who had made poor choices, but didn't deserve the severe federal penalties being sought by the prosecution. They emphasized his cooperation with investigators after his arrest, his expression of remorse for the harm he had caused, and his desire to make restitution to the victims he had defrauded. Uncle David and Aunt Linda testified as character witnesses for their son, their pain evident as they tried to balance their love for Marcus with acknowledgement of the harm he had caused. Watching them on the witness stand was excruciating. Two people who had spent decades building a life based on honesty and hard work, now forced to plead for mercy for a son whose actions had violated everything they had taught him about right and wrong. "Marcus was a good child," Aunt Linda testified, her voice barely audible as she spoke about the boy she remembered. "He was kind to his grandmother, helpful with younger cousins, respectful to elders. I don't understand how the addiction changed him so completely, how it made him capable of hurting the people who loved him most." Uncle David's testimony was more analytical but equally painful. He explained how Marcus's gambling addiction had escalated during college, how the family had tried multiple interventions and treatment programs, and how Marcus had seemed to be recovering in the months before his arrest. He said, "We thought he was getting better. He was helping with family financial matters, taking responsibility, showing maturity. We had no idea that his helpfulness was actually part of his criminal activity." The prosecution's cross-examination was respectful but thorough, establishing that Marcus's crimes required extensive planning and coordination that went beyond impulsive decisions driven by addiction. They showed evidence that Marcus had been researching potential victims and studying fraud techniques even during periods when his gambling appeared to be under control, suggesting that the criminal behavior wasn't simply a symptom of addiction, but a calculated lifestyle choice. My own testimony was the most difficult part of the trial. Speaking publicly about the betrayal of family trust, about discovering that someone I had loved and trusted had been planning to steal from me for months, felt like exposing wounds that hadn't finished healing.
but it was also empowering to speak the truth in a setting where lies and deception couldn't survive the scrutiny of legal examination.
Marcus wasn't just my cousin, I told the court. He was like an older brother, someone I looked up to and trusted completely. When I discovered that he had forged my signature to steal my grandmother's house, it wasn't just about the money or property. It was about the realization that someone I loved had been lying to me for years, had been studying me and planning to victimize me while pretending to care about my welfare. The prosecutor asked me to explain the cultural significance of family trust in Chinese American communities, how the exploitation of elderly relatives violated not just legal boundaries, but fundamental values that held families and communities together. When someone uses family relationships to commit crimes, I explained, they're not just stealing money or property, they're destroying the social fabric that allows vulnerable people to rely on younger generations for help and protection. The defense attorney's cross-examination focused on family dynamics and the pressure I had felt to pursue criminal charges rather than handling the matter privately. They suggested that cultural differences and family communication problems might have contributed to misunderstandings about financial arrangements, and that pressing criminal charges against a family member represented an overreaction that would cause more harm than good. The line of questioning was frustrating because it seemed designed to minimize the seriousness of document forgery and elder fraud by framing them as family disputes rather than crimes with real victims and lasting consequences. But it also gave me an opportunity to clarify why legal action had been necessary despite the personal cost. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a family dispute, I replied firmly. This was systematic fraud that victimized dozens of elderly people who trusted someone they believed was helping them. If we had handled this privately, Marcus would have continued targeting other vulnerable community members. Sometimes protecting the community requires making difficult choices about people you love. The trial lasted 3 weeks, each day revealing new layers of deception and manipulation that extended far beyond what any of us had initially understood. Marcus had been involved in identity theft, tax fraud, and money laundering, in addition to the forgery and elder abuse charges that had initiated the investigation. The criminal network he had joined specialized in targeting immigrant communities where language barriers and cultural unfamiliarity with American legal systems made victims less likely to report crimes or seek help from law enforcement. When the verdicts were announced, Marcus was convicted on all counts: elder fraud, document forgery, conspiracy, money laundering, and mail fraud. The judge's sentencing remarks reflected both the seriousness of the crimes and the particular betrayal involved in exploiting family and community trust. The defendant used his position as a trusted family member to systematically exploit elderly victims who had no reason to suspect that someone they loved was stealing from them, Judge Patricia Sullivan said. This type of crime strikes at the heart of the social bonds that allow vulnerable people to rely on family support during their most challenging years. Marcus was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with requirements for full restitution to his victims and participation in gambling addiction treatment programs. The sentence was longer than his defense team had hoped for, but shorter than the maximum penalties the prosecution had sought for. For our family, the length of the sentence was less important than the formal acknowledgement that serious crimes had been committed and that consequences would follow. The immediate aftermath of the trial was a mixture of relief and continued grief. Justice had been served, but the family relationships that had been destroyed by Marcus's crimes couldn't be repaired by legal proceedings. Uncle David and Aunt Linda remained devastated by their son's actions and their own failure to detect his criminal behavior. Other family members struggle with guilt about having trusted Marcus with financial information and access that had facilitated his crimes against vulnerable relatives. But the trial had also created opportunities for healing and community support that hadn't existed during the investigation phase. Mrs. Chen, Mrs. Wu, and other elderly victims found comfort in sharing their experiences and realizing that they weren't alone in having been deceived by someone they trusted. Support groups formed organically among the victims, providing social connections that helped combat the isolation and shame that many had felt after discovering they had been defrauded. The Chinese American community responded to the trial with a mixture of anger and determination to prevent similar crimes in the future.
community organizations developed educational programs about elder fraud and financial protection measures. Religious and cultural groups established support networks for elderly members who needed assistance with legal and financial matters, but wanted safeguards against exploitation. Mrs. Park from the Korean market next door organized neighborhood meetings where elderly residents could learn about warning signs of financial fraud and connect with social services that provided independent assistance with legal and financial matters. "We can't let fear of being deceived prevent us from helping each other," she said during one of these meetings. "But we need to create systems that protect vulnerable people while still maintaining the family and community support that we all depend on." 6 months after the trial ended, I finally felt ready to visit grandmother's house on Maple Street. The property had been held in legal limbo during the investigation and trial, but with Marcus's conviction, the forged documents were officially invalidated and clear title was restored to me as the rightful inheritor. Walking through the rooms where I had spent countless childhood hours felt both familiar and strange, as if the house itself had been changed by the knowledge of what had almost happened to it. The study where grandmother had kept her important papers looked exactly as she had left it, with neatly organized files, and the antique desk where she had written letters to relatives in China and managed the household finances with characteristic precision. But now I couldn't help but think about Marcus sitting in this same chair, going through these same files, studying signatures and financial documents with predatory intent rather than filial concern. I found myself drawn to a small wooden box on the desk that contained letters I had written to grandmother over the years, the same letters that Marcus had studied to learn to forge my signature. Reading them now, seeing my own handwriting in the context of how it had been exploited, was painful but also healing. These letters represented genuine love and connection, the real relationships that Marcus's crimes had tried to corrupt but couldn't ultimately destroy. The decision about what to do with the house was complicated by both practical and emotional considerations. The property was worth significantly more than when grandmother had purchased it decades earlier, representing financial security that could support my future in ways she had intended. But it was also a tangible connection to family history and cultural identity that felt precious beyond any monetary value. After months of consideration, I decided to convert the house into a community resource that would honor grandmother's memory while addressing the vulnerabilities that Marcus's crimes had exposed. Working with community organizations and legal aid groups, I established the Mei-Lin Chen Center for Elder Protection, a nonprofit organization that provided free legal and financial assistance to elderly immigrants who needed help navigating complex American bureaucratic systems. The center offered services that ranged from basic document translation to comprehensive estate planning, all provided by volunteers who understood the cultural and linguistic barriers that made elderly immigrants vulnerable to exploitation. But perhaps most importantly, it created a safe space where elderly community members could seek help without having to rely exclusively on family members who might have conflicts of interest or ulterior motives. The transformation of grandmother's house into a community resource felt like the most appropriate way to honor her memory and the painful lessons we had learned from Marcus's crimes. She had always believed in using whatever resources you had to help others build better lives, and turning her final gift into a tool for protecting vulnerable community members seemed like exactly what she would have wanted. The center's opening ceremony drew more than 200 people from across the Chinese-American community, including many of Marcus's victims who had found strength and purpose in advocating for elder protection measures. Mrs. Chen cut the ribbon with hands that still trembled slightly from age, but held steady with determination. "This house will protect people the way Mei-Lin protected us. Her grandson tried to steal from us, but her granddaughter is giving back to us. That's the difference between honor and shame."
Uncle David and Aunt Linda attended the ceremony, their presence both appreciated and complicated by the ongoing grief that Marcus's actions had caused throughout the family. Their son's crimes had created a debt that could never be fully repaid, but their support for the center represented an acknowledgement of responsibility and a commitment to preventing similar tragedies in the future. "We can't undo what Marcus did," Uncle David said during the ceremony, his voice steady despite the obvious emotional difficulty of speaking publicly about his son's crimes. "But we can work to make sure that other families don't suffer the same kind of betrayal. Linda and I will be supporting this center because we believe it represents the values that we tried to teach our children, even though we failed with our son. The center's programs expanded rapidly as word spread about the services it provided and the protection it offered to elderly community members who needed assistance with financial and legal matters. Volunteer attorneys provided free consultations about estate planning and fraud prevention. Volunteer accountants helped elderly residents understand their financial options and identify potential warning signs of exploitation. Most importantly, the center created a network of trust that allowed vulnerable people to seek help without having to rely exclusively on family members who might not always have their best interests at heart. 2 years after the center opened, I received a letter that would bring an unexpected form of closure to the entire ordeal. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to the center rather than my personal address, written in handwriting that I recognized immediately despite not having seen it in the 3 years since Marcus's trial. The envelope was plain white, bearing only a federal prison return address and my name written in the careful script that had once forged my signature, but now seemed smaller, more hesitant. I stared at the letter for several minutes before opening it, uncertain whether I was ready to hear from the person whose actions had reshaped my understanding of family, trust, and justice. The center was quiet that morning. Mrs. Chen was in the garden tending to the vegetables she had planted in grandmother's former flower beds, and the volunteer attorneys wouldn't arrive until afternoon. The silence gave me space to process whatever Marcus might have written, whether it would be genuine remorse or another attempt at manipulation. The letter was longer than I had expected, written across several pages in handwriting that showed none of the confident flourishes I remembered from his earlier years. The tone was different too, subdued, reflective, lacking the charm and easy confidence that had once made him so persuasive. He began by acknowledging that he had no right to contact me, that his crimes had destroyed any claim he might have had on my attention or forgiveness. But he wanted me to know about the work he had been doing in prison, both in addressing his gambling addiction and in helping other inmates understand the impact of financial crimes on their victims. I've been participating in a victim impact program where people like me have to confront the real consequences of what we've done, not just the legal consequences, but the human ones. I've learned about elderly victims who lost their homes, who couldn't afford medical care, who died alone because they could no longer trust the family members who had stolen from them. I understand now that what I did wasn't just theft. It was a form of murder, killing the trust and security that elderly people need to survive. The letter described how Marcus had become involved in prison programs that educated inmates about elder abuse and financial fraud, helping them understand the particular cruelty of crimes that targeted vulnerable populations. He had completed his GED and was working toward a bachelor's degree in social work with plans to dedicate his life after release to elder protection advocacy. Whether this transformation was genuine or simply another performance designed to impress parole boards remains to be seen, but something in the tone of his writing suggested a level of self-awareness that hadn't existed during his criminal years.
But the most significant part of the letter was Marcus's acknowledgement of how his crimes had affected not just his direct victims, but the entire structure of trust that held our community together. He had heard about the center from other inmates whose families lived in our area, and he understood that his actions had created a need for institutional protections that shouldn't have been necessary if family members could be trusted to act with honor and integrity. When I learned about what you did with grandmother's house, he wrote, I felt proud and ashamed at the same time. Proud because you turned something I tried to destroy into something that protects other people. Ashamed because my actions made that protection necessary. You took the worst thing I ever did and transformed it into something that honors grandmother's memory and serves the community she loved. That's the kind of person she raised you to be, and it's the kind of person I should have been, but chose not to be. The letter concluded with a request that I knew would be difficult to fulfill, regardless of how I felt about Marcus personally.
He asked if I would be willing to participate in a victim impact program where he could speak directly with someone he had harmed, not seeking forgiveness, but offering a genuine apology and acknowledgement of the damage he had caused. Prison officials encourage such meetings when they might provide healing for victims and genuine accountability for perpetrators, but the decision was entirely mine to make. I set the letter aside and spent the rest of the day working with elderly visitors to the center, helping Mrs. Park review her insurance policies and assisting Mr. Zhang with understanding a legal notice he had received about property taxes. The routine work of protecting vulnerable community members felt more meaningful than ever in light of Marcus's letter, a reminder that the center's mission extended far beyond our family's private tragedy to address systemic vulnerabilities that affected dozens of elderly immigrants who needed advocates they could trust without reservation. That evening, I called Detective Morrison, who had maintained contact with our family even after the trial concluded. His experience with similar cases had taught him that closure was often a long process that extended far beyond legal proceedings, and he had seen both genuine rehabilitation and calculated manipulation among white-collar criminals serving federal sentences. The fact that he wrote to you directly rather than through his lawyer or family members is interesting, Detective Morrison observed. In my experience, inmates who are primarily focused on reducing their sentences or appealing their convictions usually try to work through intermediaries who can help them legally. Writing directly to a victim suggests either genuine remorse or a very sophisticated understanding of how to appear genuinely remorseful. We discussed the Victim Impact Program that Marcus had mentioned, which was a legitimate federal initiative designed to provide accountability and closure for both perpetrators and victims of financial crimes. Detective Morrison explained that such programs could be genuinely beneficial when approached with realistic expectations and appropriate support, but they required careful preparation to ensure that victims weren't subjected to additional manipulation or emotional harm. The question you need to ask yourself, you said, is whether participating would help you heal or just reopen wounds that have started to close. There's no obligation to forgive or engage with someone who has harmed you, regardless of how sincere their remorse might appear. Your primary responsibility is to yourself and to the community you're now serving through the center. After weeks of consideration and discussions with Mrs. Hartwell, who had remained a trusted advisor throughout the entire ordeal, I decided to participate in the Victim Impact Program. My motivation wasn't forgiveness, I wasn't ready for that and might never be, but rather a desire to understand whether Marcus's apparent transformation was genuine and whether his future actions might honor or continue to betray the memory of the people he had victimized. The meeting took place in a sterile conference room at the federal prison, supervised by counselors who specialized in victim offender dialogue. Marcus appeared smaller than I remembered, not just physically, but in some essential way that suggested the confidence and charm that had once defined him had been fundamentally altered by his experiences in prison. He wore standard prison clothing and carried himself with none of the easy assurance that had once made him so persuasive.
The conversation was structured and carefully moderated, focused on allowing Marcus to take full responsibility for his actions, without seeking anything in return from me. He spoke about the progression of his gambling addiction and how it had led him to rationalize increasingly serious crimes as temporary solutions to financial problems. But he also acknowledged that addiction alone couldn't explain the calculated nature of his frauds or the particular cruelty of targeting elderly family members who trusted him completely. The planning involved in what I did proves that this wasn't just impulsive behavior driven by addiction, he said, looking directly at me for the first time since I had entered the room. I researched your schedule, studied your handwriting, calculated when and how to file forged documents. That level of premeditation shows that I had become someone willing to systematically betray the people who loved me most. Addiction might explain why I needed money, but it doesn't excuse the choice to get that money by destroying the trust that held our family together. Most importantly,
Marcus spoke about his understanding of how his crimes had affected not just individual victims, but the entire structure of community support that elderly immigrants depended on for survival and dignity. He had learned about other cases where family members had exploited elderly relatives, and he understood that his actions had contributed to a climate of suspicion that made vulnerable people less likely to seek help when they needed it most. What I did to grandmother, to Mrs. Chen, to all of them, it wasn't just theft. It was an attack on the social bonds that allow elderly people to age with dignity and security. When family members become predators, it destroys the foundation of trust that everything else is built on. I understand now that the center you created isn't just about providing services. It's about rebuilding trust that people like me destroyed. The meeting lasted 2 hours, and by the end, I felt a complex mixture of emotions that would take months to fully process. Marcus's remorse appeared genuine, but genuine remorse couldn't undo the harm he had caused or restore the relationships he had destroyed. His transformation might prevent him from committing similar crimes in the future, but it couldn't bring back the sense of family security that his betrayal had shattered. What I did gain from the meeting was a sense of closure around the question of whether Marcus understood the full scope of what he had done. His acknowledgement of the harm he had caused was more complete and thoughtful than I had expected, suggesting that his years in prison had provided genuine insight into the nature of trust and betrayal that he had previously lacked. 6 months later, I received word that Marcus had been accepted into a master's degree program in social work that would allow him to specialize in elder advocacy upon his release from prison. The program was competitive and required demonstrated commitment to serving vulnerable populations, suggesting that his rehabilitation efforts were being taken seriously by professionals who understood the complexities of criminal transformation. Whether Marcus would ultimately honor that commitment remained to be seen, but the center continued its work regardless of his future choices. By our 3rd anniversary, we had served over 800 elderly community members, providing legal assistance, financial education, and social support that helped protect vulnerable people from exploitation while maintaining their independence and dignity. The success of the center attracted attention from other communities dealing with similar challenges, and we began consulting with organizations in different cities about replicating our model. The idea of transforming sites of victimization into resources for protection and empowerment resonated with communities that had experienced elder fraud and wanted to address systemic vulnerabilities rather than simply responding to individual crimes after they occurred. Mrs. Chen, now 86, had become the unofficial ambassador of the center, greeting new visitors and sharing her own story of victimization and recovery as a way of helping others understand that being deceived didn't reflect personal failure, but rather the sophisticated nature of modern financial crimes. Her presence in grandmother's former home felt like a continuation of the hospitality and community service that always had defined the house on Maple Street. "This house has always been about taking care of people," she often told visitors during tours of the center. "Mei-Lin took care of her family and her community, and now her granddaughter is using this same house to take care of all of us. That's how honor works. It passes from generation to generation, getting stronger instead of weaker." On the 4th anniversary of grandmother's death, I stood in the center's main room, what had once been her living room, surrounded by photographs that told the story of what the space had become. Pictures of elderly clients receiving legal assistance, volunteers providing financial education, community members participating in cultural celebrations that honored both tradition and protection. The room was filled with the same warmth and purpose it had always held, but now that warmth extended beyond family boundaries to embrace an entire community of people who needed advocates they could trust without reservation. The mahogany conference table where I had first learned about the forged documents now served as a workspace where elderly community members could review legal papers with volunteer attorneys who had no conflicts of interest and no hidden agendas. The transformation felt complete. A site of betrayal had become a sanctuary of trust, a place where grandmother's values of community service and family protection could flourish despite the attempts of one person to corrupt them. Marcus would be eligible for parole in 6 years, and when that time came, he would face a community that had been forever changed by his actions. The center's work would continue regardless of his choices, but the institution we had built would serve as both a protection against future predators and a testament to the possibility of transforming harm into healing through sustained commitment to serving others. As I locked the center's doors that evening and walked past the garden where Mrs. Chen's vegetables grew in the same soil where grandmother had once tended flowers, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. The forged signatures that had started everything were now displayed in a frame on the center's wall, not as trophies, but as reminders of the vigilance required to protect trust and the courage necessary to seek justice when that trust has been violated. The family dinners at our restaurant had resumed, though they were smaller now and shadowed by an awareness of how fragile family bonds could be when tested by individual choices about honor and integrity. But the center had created new kinds of family relationships, bonds based not on blood, but on shared commitment to protecting the vulnerable and serving the community with transparency and accountability. Uncle David and Aunt Linda continued to support the center's work, their contributions representing both penance for their son's crimes and genuine commitment to preventing similar tragedies in the future. Their presence at center events was sometimes awkward, but it also demonstrated the possibility of taking responsibility for family failures while working to rebuild trust through sustained action rather than empty words. The story that had begun with forged signatures and document fraud had evolved into something larger, a community-wide commitment to elder protection, and a demonstration that individual acts of betrayal, however devastating, couldn't ultimately destroy the values and relationships that define us if we're willing to fight for them with persistence and courage. Standing on the front porch of the house that grandmother had left me, now transformed into a resource that served dozens of families every week, I felt the weight of both loss and legacy. Marcus had tried to steal my inheritance, but what I had actually inherited was something more valuable than property or money. It was the responsibility to honor grandmother's memory by protecting the community she had loved and served throughout her life. The forged signatures were gone, replaced by genuine documents that protected rather than exploited, served rather than stole, and honored rather than betrayed the trust that holds communities together. In the end, that transformation represented the most complete victory possible over the forces that had tried to corrupt what grandmother had built. Not just legal justice, but the restoration of purpose and the multiplication of protection for people who deserved advocates they could trust without reservation. The mahogany conference table gleamed under the soft light of evening, its polished surface now reflecting not confusion and betrayal, but clarity and service. Tomorrow would bring new elderly clients seeking help with legal documents, new volunteers offering their expertise to protect vulnerable community members, and new opportunities to transform individual acts of service into lasting institutional protection for people who needed advocates they could trust completely.
The grandfather clock in the corner continued its rhythmic ticking, marking time that moved forward toward a future built on the foundation of lessons learned through loss, justice sought through courage, and service offered through love. In the end, that steady rhythm represented the most fitting memorial to grandmother's legacy: time devoted to protecting others, moments spent building trust, hours invested in ensuring that vulnerable people could age with dignity and security in a community that honored
rather than exploited their trust. The forged signature case was closed, but the work of protecting trust and serving others would continue as long as there were people willing to choose service over self-interest, protection over predation, and honor over exploitation. That choice, made new each day by dozens of volunteers and hundreds of community members, represented the true inheritance grandmother had left. Not just property or money, but the responsibility to build a world where trust could flourish and vulnerable people could find protection when they needed it most. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.